Simon Crow had never imagined that moving into a quiet house on the border of a state preserve would become the most complicated decision of his life. When he first unlocked the front door and carried in the few boxes of equipment and clothes that made up his modest life, he felt only relief. Here was a place where he could finally create without interruption. By profession, he was an audio designer for independent video games, a man who built entire worlds of sound for players who never thought about how a subtle rustle of leaves or the echo of water in a cave came to be. His craft demanded silence around him, a silence he could capture and bend into whatever shape his imagination required. The house had come to him through a mixture of luck and circumstance. An uncle who had loved the land but left no heirs closer than Simon had willed it to him. Simon had not grown up visiting this place, but the first time he set foot in the backyard he felt an almost irrational connection to the rows of ancient oaks that marked the property's edge. Their trunks were thick, their branches spreading wide, and their shadows changed shape with every hour of daylight as if performing for him. He was not sentimental by nature, but he found himself recording their creaks and groans in the wind, as if they were speaking to him in a language only microphones could catch. The neighborhood itself seemed unremarkable at first glance. There were carefully aligned houses, neatly paved sidewalks, and mailboxes painted in uniform colors that betrayed the strict presence of a homeowners association. Simon barely registered this fact at the time, because his plot extended further back than most, opening onto a gentle slope, where the oak trees stood like sentinels at the boundary. Beyond them began the wider preserve, and although Simon did not yet know the legal intricacies of where his land ended and the park began, he felt secure enough to treat it all as a sanctuary. He had no desire to fight with anyone about boundaries. He simply wanted to live quietly, work steadily, and let the world of deadlines and constant digital noise recede far behind him. The first few weeks seemed almost idyllic. Simon unpacked his equipment, set up a small studio in what had once been a den, and began working on a project that required him to compose an entire environment of forest sounds. He would take long walks among the oaks, collecting hours of ambient recordings, birds hidden high in the canopy, the chatter of squirrels, the distant hum of cicadas. The land felt alive in a way that resonated with him, not as something to be owned, but as something to be preserved and listened to. He had never been a man who sought community, and so he declined casual invitations from neighbors who stopped by with polite smiles. They seemed pleasant enough, though he noticed a stiffness in their greetings, as if they were testing how compliant he might be with the invisible codes of the association. He assumed it was nothing more than suburban formality, and thought little of it. One evening, while cataloging recordings in his studio, Simon looked out the window at the oaks swaying in a slow rhythm. The fading light turned their leaves gold, and the scene filled him with a calm he had not known in years. It reminded him of the first time he had realized sound could shape emotion, back when he was a teenager experimenting with cheap microphones. The oaks became more than trees to him. They were anchors, living instruments that grounded his creative energy. He promised himself he would never alter them, never cut or trim them for convenience, because they were older than the houses around them and deserved to remain untouched. That sense of responsibility, quiet and personal, rooted itself in him long before the first letter arrived in his mailbox. Long before the homeowners association would decide that the oaks were nothing more than obstacles to be removed. For now, Simon believed he had found the perfect refuge: a modest house, a cluster of ancient trees, and the illusion that the world beyond his fence would leave him alone. It was the calm before he understood that silence in such neighborhoods is rarely natural. It is the kind of silence that masks watchful eyes, whispered meetings, and a set of rules written not to protect beauty, but to control it. And soon enough he would discover that those rules had already turned toward him. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, slipped into Simon's mailbox with the same impersonal weight as junk flyers and grocery store coupons. Yet the thick paper and embossed seal immediately told him this was not something to ignore. He carried it inside without urgency, placing it on the kitchen table beside a half-finished cup of coffee, but something in the formal lettering on the envelope kept drawing his attention back until finally he tore it open. The contents were written in that peculiar tone used by bureaucracies that pride themselves on clarity, yet drip with quiet intimidation. The Homeowners Association was demanding that he arrange for the immediate removal of several oak trees located on the rear boundary of his property, citing safety concerns related to falling limbs and non-compliance with landscaping guidelines. It gave him exactly 30 days to act, after which penalties and fines would accrue, and if unaddressed further legal remedies could be pursued. Simon read the lines twice, then a third time, before a bitter laugh escaped him. The oaks in question had stood there for decades, perhaps a century, rooted long before the development of these sterile houses and manicured lawns. He had seen nothing dangerous about them, nothing diseased or unstable, and he could not imagine why anyone would view them as a violation of aesthetics. At first he assumed the letter must have been sent in error. Maybe the association's records were outdated or confused his lot with another. He placed the notice on his desk and tried to continue work, yet the words clung to his concentration, unraveling every thread of sound he tried to compose. That afternoon he dialed the number listed at the bottom of the letter, expecting to reach a secretary who would apologize for the mistake. Instead, he was transferred twice before a brusque male voice informed him that the order was correct and binding. Simon pressed for details, asking which specific guidelines he had supposedly violated, but the man replied only that vegetation extending into community space must meet uniform safety standards, a phrase so vague it seemed designed to prevent argument. When Simon pointed out that the trees were nowhere near power lines, the voice simply repeated the deadline and ended the call. A wave of unease spread through him. He retrieved the property documents left by his uncle and carefully examined the boundaries, comparing them with online county maps. To his astonishment, the lines were not entirely consistent. While his deed clearly showed his property ending at a natural ridge where the first oak stood, a homeowners association map he found online extended their jurisdiction deeper into the preserve, swallowing that ridge and part of the forest into the neighborhood's official layout. It looked less like a simple mistake and more like a quiet expansion, as if the association had redrawn its reach without anyone outside the board questioning it. Simon was unsettled but not yet alarmed. He assumed such discrepancies would be easy to clarify through the county office. The following week, however, a second letter arrived, sterner than the first. This one included a photograph, an aerial view of his backyard with bright red circles drawn around the oaks, each labeled hazard. The photograph unsettled him more than the words because the angle could only have been captured by a drone, and drone flights were strictly forbidden in this part of the preserve. He stared at the grainy image of his trees, the invasive gaze from above, and felt a violation deeper than legal language could express. He had chosen this house precisely for its privacy, yet here was evidence that someone hovered above his sanctuary, marking it like prey. Simon drove to the county office 2 days later, carrying the deed and the letters. The clerk, a woman with tired eyes behind rectangular glasses, listened patiently as he explained his concern, then entered the parcel number into her computer. After several minutes, she frowned and shook her head. According to official county records, she explained, the rear portion of Simon's land intersected with acreage designated decades ago as part of a state bio-corridor program. The exact line had always been complex because developments in the early 2000s were built too close to the preserve, but the protected status of the oaks remained intact. She even printed a copy of the official registry, showing the boundary highlighted in green, which placed those trees firmly under the protection of the state. The Homeowners Association has no authority back there, she told him matter-of-factly. They might be using an old map, but legally their jurisdiction ends before those trees begin. She suggested he send them a copy of the registry and consider contacting the Regional Department of Natural Resources if the association persisted. Relieved, Simon returned home with the documents, but his relief was fragile. He sensed that presenting evidence would not be enough because the letters he had received did not read like mistakes waiting to be corrected. They read like commands expecting compliance. Nevertheless, he drafted a respectful reply to the association, attached the county registry, and requested written confirmation that the matter was closed. Days passed without a response. Then, on a Monday morning, he found a plastic tag tied around one of the oak trunks at the far edge of his property. The tag was bright orange and bore black letters. Inspected. Removal pending. No one had asked permission to enter his land, no one had notified him of an inspection, and there were no footprints in the soil except for a set of heavy boot marks, leading from the cul-de-sac directly into his trees. The discovery chilled him more than the letters. Someone had trespassed, left their mark, and departed without a word, confident that he would see it. That night he sat on his porch listening to the creak of branches in the wind, wondering how a quiet life had become entangled in invisible rules. He was not a man prone to paranoia, but he could not shake the thought that the oaks were not the real issue. They were symbols, leverage for an association that thrived on obedience. Perhaps they expected him to fold quickly, to schedule the removal without protest, the way most people in the neighborhood probably did when confronted with such notices. But Simon was not most people, and the oaks were not negotiable. He decided he would resist, though he had no clear plan how. The catalyst had been set in motion. What had begun as a letter in his mailbox was hardening into a battle for the right to let old trees stand where they had always stood, and Simon felt the quiet certainty that the conflict would only escalate from here. The morning after finding the orange tag on his oak, Simon decided he could no longer treat the matter as a misunderstanding. He gathered every piece of documentation he had collected so far, the deed, the county registry, the letters from the association, and drove to the HOA office, which was located in a nondescript commercial plaza between a dry cleaner and a dentist. The building looked unimposing from the outside, but as soon as he stepped inside, he felt the same tightening in his chest that he associated with airports and courtrooms, places where rules were written by invisible authorities and enforced by people who smiled too widely. The receptionist, a woman with carefully styled hair and an expression that never shifted from neutral politeness, asked for his name and then told him to wait. 10 minutes later, he was led into a small conference room where a tall woman in a pale suit introduced herself as Linda Perlman, the newly elected president of the HOA board. She extended a manicured hand, but her eyes were cool, and Simon immediately understood that this meeting was not intended to resolve anything in his favor. He explained patiently that the oak trees in question were not under HOA jurisdiction, that they were protected under state designation, and that any attempt to cut them down would be unlawful. He laid the county registry on the table and slid it toward her. Linda glanced at the papers without touching them, then leaned back in her chair with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She told him in a voice both calm and dismissive that his interpretation was mistaken, that the association operated under revised community guidelines updated 2 years ago, and that all properties abutting the development were now subject to uniform landscaping standards. Simon asked how such authority could override state protection, but she brushed the question aside, saying only that residents are expected to comply, and that if he had further objections he could hire legal counsel. Her tone was not aggressive, but the indifference in her delivery was worse. It was the tone of someone who believed completely in her position and considered his resistance a mere inconvenience. Simon pressed, asking why an inspection had been conducted without his consent, and why a removal tag had been placed on his property. Linda smiled again, saying that community contractors had authorization to enter common adjacency zones and that their assessments were final. Simon corrected her firmly, stating that there was nothing common about his land, that the oak stood within his deed's boundary, and that the association had trespassed. At this, her expression hardened. She warned him that defiance could carry consequences not only in fines, but also in assessments against his property value, which might affect his to refinance or sell in the future. It was a thinly veiled threat, and Simon felt heat rising in his chest as he realized how calculated her words were. He left the office shaken, not because he doubted his evidence, but because he understood now that he was not dealing with an honest mistake. The association knew exactly what it was doing. It was exerting pressure through the weight of bureaucracy, betting that he would fold under the hassle and expense of resistance. That evening, when he walked to the ridge where the oaks stood, he noticed something else that disturbed him. Faint chalk lines sprayed on the soil around two of the trees, as if someone had marked them for cutting. The markings had not been there the day before. Whoever placed them had done so quietly, perhaps at night, and again without permission. Simon began documenting everything. He took photographs of the chalk, the boot prints, the orange tag, and he stored digital copies of every letter in multiple places. Yet he knew documentation alone would not stop them. The next escalation arrived faster than he expected. 3 days later, while working in his studio, he heard the distant rumble of a truck engine. Looking out the back window, he saw a white utility vehicle parked near the cul-de-sac, its hazard lights flashing. 2 men in reflective vests were unloading equipment, chainsaws, hard hats, and bundles of orange cones. His heart pounded as he realized they were preparing to cut. He rushed outside, crossed the yard, and intercepted them before they could step onto the slope. When he demanded to know who had authorized their presence, one of the men handed him a laminated work order issued under the name of the Homeowners Association, listing his address and specifying removal of hazardous oaks, Phase 1. Simon told them flatly that the work order was invalid because the land was not under HOA jurisdiction and because the trees were protected by state designation. The men exchanged uneasy glances. They were contractors, not enforcers, and clearly had no interest in legal disputes. After a tense pause, they reloaded their tools and left, muttering that they would need to check with the office. The relief Simon felt was fleeting, because he knew the association would interpret this not as resolution, but as provocation. That night, another letter appeared in his mailbox, this time with sharper language. It stated that he had interfered with authorized community maintenance and warned that further obstruction could result in legal penalties. The phrase chilled him because it implied criminalization of his defense. He sat at his desk, staring at the letter, and realized how easily narratives could be rewritten. In the eyes of the HOA, he was not a resident protecting his property, but a troublemaker standing in the way of community safety. The pressure built in subtle ways as well. Neighbors who had once greeted him with forced politeness now avoided eye contact entirely. He noticed blinds shifting when he walked past, doors closing quickly, the unmistakable ripple of gossip spreading through the neighborhood. He had become a subject. A cautionary tale told at dinner tables about the man who refused to cooperate. And yet he could not relent, because each time he looked at the oaks he saw not only their grandeur but also the quiet principle at stake. If rules could be bent to erase trees older than the neighborhood itself, then anything could be justified in the name of compliance. By the end of that week, Simon realized he was standing on the edge of a much larger conflict than he had anticipated. The HOA had made its first move, not by cutting the trees but by marking them, threatening them, and sending men with chainsaws to his doorstep. They were testing his resolve, probing for weakness. He understood with heavy certainty that this was only the beginning, that the escalation had entered its first true stage, and that every decision he made from this point forward would either protect the oaks or doom them. The battle lines were no longer abstract. They were chalked into the soil at the base of his trees. Simon had thought he understood the shape of the conflict, but the deeper he pressed into the matter, the more he realized the ground beneath him was not simply uneven, but actively shifting. The association had marked his trees, dispatched contractors, and attempted to reframe his defense as obstruction, but all of that could be explained away as the ordinary heavy-handedness of a suburban board. What unsettled him most was the silence that followed after he blocked the first attempt at removal. Days passed with no letters, no contractors, no chalk lines. The absence of activity should have relieved him, yet it produced a worse anxiety than any direct confrontation, because he knew silence in such disputes was never neutral. It meant something was happening out of sight. Driven by the need for certainty, he contacted the regional office of the Department of Natural Resources and explained his situation. To his surprise, the call was returned not by a clerk but by an inspector named Joanna Lee, who agreed to review the boundary issue in person. When she arrived one afternoon, Simon was struck by her calm efficiency. She carried a weathered satchel filled with maps, legal printouts, and surveying equipment, and as she stepped onto his back slope, she greeted the oaks like colleagues rather than scenery. She walked the boundary slowly, checking coordinates on a GPS unit, then compared them with Simon's deed and the state's ecological registry. After nearly an hour, she confirmed what the county clerk had already told him. The trees stood on land formerly designated as part of a biocorridor program established decades earlier to protect wildlife migration routes. The designation superseded all local governance, including homeowners associations, which meant the HOA had no legal right to demand their removal. Yet Joanna's demeanor remained cautious. She advised Simon to keep his documents secure and to record every communication, because she had seen similar cases where associations attempted to override protected boundaries by citing outdated plats or misapplied bylaws. She mentioned that a review of complaints against his neighborhood's HOA was already pending at the state level, though nothing official had been released. When Simon asked whether he should present the evidence directly to Linda Perlman, Joanna shook her head, warning that premature confrontation could compromise the investigation. "They count on people reacting emotionally," she explained. "If you hold steady and keep the evidence clean, the law will favor you." Simon thanked her and felt a rare spark of relief, but that relief was complicated by her final words. As she packed her maps, she lowered her voice and admitted that her department had been under pressure to reduce enforcement actions in suburban zones, pressure that came not from budgetary limits but from lobbying by development groups and legal firms connected to HOA networks. If this were purely ecological law, she said, there would be no question. But politics is a second law running beneath the first. With that, she left, promising to file a preliminary report that would at least freeze any immediate attempts at removal. For several nights, Simon slept easier, convinced that an official buffer now stood between him and the association's ambitions. Then, one morning, he discovered the state's small green placard that had always stood at the edge of the preserve was gone. It had been a simple sign, hardly noticed by anyone, but to Simon it had been a reassurance that his land was more than a line on paper. Now, in its place, stood a fresh post bearing a plastic sign stamped with the HOA's logo and the words Community Landscape Zone. The implication was clear. Someone had not only removed state property but replaced it with a false claim of authority. His initial instinct was to call Joanna, but he hesitated, realizing that if he involved her too often it might appear as if he were orchestrating the conflict. Instead, he photographed the sign from every angle and stored the images in multiple folders, another piece of evidence in a growing archive of trespasses. What disturbed him more than the sign was the reaction of his neighbors. That evening, as he returned from a walk, he noticed two residents standing at the end of the cul-de-sac, speaking in low tones and glancing toward his yard. When they noticed him, they fell silent, their faces neutral, as though they had been caught observing something they were not supposed to. Simon nodded politely, but they turned away without acknowledging him. It was the first time he truly felt the social isolation of his position. The association was not only pressing him legally, it was reshaping perception among those who lived around him, casting him as an antagonist against community interests. The sense of tightening pressure culminated a week later when he received a letter not from the HOA, but from the county planning department. The letter stated that a review had been initiated into disputed jurisdictional boundaries between the association and the state preserve, and until the matter was resolved, no protective designation could be enforced. The language was dry, bureaucratic, but Simon recognized the maneuver immediately. The HOA had used its connections to suspend the very protection Joanna had confirmed. On paper, the Oaks now existed in a limbo where neither side held final authority, which meant the association could continue to treat them as hazards while the state was unable to intervene. The discovery infuriated him, yet it also clarified the stakes. He realized that the association was not acting blindly but strategically, manipulating procedural gray zones to manufacture authority where none existed. The midpoint of his struggle had arrived. He could no longer treat this as a nuisance to be endured. It was a contest of endurance between his solitary defense and a system designed to exhaust him into compliance. Standing beneath the vast canopy of the oaks that evening, he pressed his hand against the ridged bark and felt a strange solidarity. They had endured storms, droughts, and decades of human encroachment. He resolved that he would endure too, no matter how convoluted the battle became. His determination solidified further when Joanna called him the next day with troubling news. She had been abruptly reassigned to another district, her report on his case shelved indefinitely. She admitted privately that her reassignment was unusual and suspected it was connected to the HOA's complaint. Before ending the call, she urged him to hold firm and to be meticulous in documenting every intrusion. Sometimes the record itself is stronger than the voice making it, she said. Her departure left Simon feeling exposed, yet it also convinced him that the association feared the truth of his evidence. That night he returned to his studio, replaying his field recordings of the forest. As he listened to the layered voices of insects, wind, and distant owls, he noticed something he had not caught before. In one of the tracks, a faint conversation bled into the background, voices carried from somewhere down the slope. Straining to isolate it, he distinguished fragments of a dialogue about adjusting the registry and moving the line before anyone checks deeper. The voices were distorted by distance, but the implication was unmistakable. Without intending to, Simon had captured an admission of deliberate manipulation, and the realization filled him with both dread and resolve. The midpoint was no longer about proving his innocence against a mistaken order. It was about exposing a deliberate strategy to seize land that did not belong to the association. For the first time, Simon understood that the oaks were not merely trees to them. They were markers of a boundary they wanted erased. The knowledge steeled him. The silence that had unsettled him was gone, replaced by a certainty that the conflict had deepened into something far more dangerous, and that he could no longer afford to treat any of it as coincidence. The weeks following Joanna's removal from his case felt like a tightening vice around Simon's life. The HOA no longer bothered with polite notices or vaguely worded warnings. Instead, they shifted their strategy toward a campaign of steady intrusion, as though the aim was not to cut down the Oaks directly but to exhaust him until he allowed it himself. The first sign of this shift came on a Monday morning when Simon awoke to the growl of machinery. From his kitchen window he saw another set of contractors unloading equipment near the cul-de-sac, this time carrying long stakes and rolls of orange plastic fencing. When he went outside to confront them, they informed him blandly that they had been authorized to begin a landscape safety perimeter on his slope. He argued furiously, waving the deed and county registry in their faces, but they shrugged and explained they were only following a work order signed by the association's board. Simon demanded they leave, and though they eventually packed up and drove off, their indifference rattled him more than open hostility would have. It was clear that the HOA could summon strangers to his doorstep at will, and that every confrontation drained him of time and energy. That evening he found something more unsettling. Pinned to his front door was a bright yellow violation notice accusing him of obstructing official maintenance and warning that fines would now be applied daily until compliance was confirmed. The letter carried a total already calculated, hundreds of dollars for just a single day, and a line noting that unpaid amounts could be attached as liens against his property. Simon read the words 3 times, feeling a strange mix of anger and dread. It was one thing to argue over trees, another to see the threat evolve into numbers that could jeopardize the roof over his head. He knew the lien threat was premature and likely unenforceable given the disputed jurisdiction, but he also knew how easily bureaucracies used paperwork to make falsehoods look inevitable. By now, the atmosphere among his neighbors had shifted from unease to quiet hostility. Where once they had looked away, now they whispered openly when he passed. One afternoon, as he carried groceries from his car, a man across the street muttered loudly enough to be heard, asking his companion why Simon couldn't just do what everyone else did and follow the rules. Simon did not respond, but the words stayed with him, evidence that the HOA's narrative was seeping into the social fabric of the community. He was being isolated not just legally but socially, painted as a selfish outsider who endangered the neighborhood's order. It was a tactic as old as any form of control. Make resistance appear antisocial, and the crowd will enforce compliance without the enforcers ever raising a hand. The second escalation reached a more tangible form later that week when Simon discovered fresh damage to one of the oaks. A section of bark near the base had been deliberately gouged, leaving a scar that oozed sap. He knelt beside it, running his fingers along the wound, and recognized at once that this was no natural crack from weather or age. Someone had struck the tree with a blade, not enough to fell it, but enough to weaken it over time. The realization filled him with a sickened anger, because it revealed the HOA's strategy more clearly than any letter. If they could not legally cut the trees, they would slowly destroy them until their removal seemed like a matter of safety. He photographed the wound, measured its size, and filed everything in his growing archive. But documentation did little to calm the feeling that he was engaged in a war of attrition against an opponent who would never tire. That night he considered contacting Joanna again, but he remembered her warning about political pressure and her reassignment. Instead, he decided to broaden his approach, researching past cases where HOAs had overreached their authority. He discovered article after article about small associations manipulating maps, issuing false fines, and forcing sales of homes over trivial violations. What struck him most was how often homeowners simply gave up, unwilling or unable to endure the cost of resistance. He read late into the night, realizing that his story was not unique but part of a pattern that thrived precisely because few ever carried the fight to the end. This knowledge strengthened his resolve but also deepened his isolation. Knowing others had been crushed before him was not comforting. It was a reminder of how long the odds were. The pressure reached its most brazen form 2 days later. Simon awoke before dawn to the sound of voices outside and stepped onto his porch to see 3 men in reflective vests working at the base of his slope. They were hammering metal stakes into the soil, stringing more orange fencing, and one of them carried a clipboard with the HOA's logo. Simon called out angrily, demanding to know what they were doing. One of the men replied without hesitation that they were preparing for scheduled removal, since his non-compliance had been recorded. Simon shouted that the land was state-protected and that their presence was illegal trespass. The man with the clipboard smirked and replied that the association's revised bylaws superseded any outdated paperwork he might have, and that if he wished to challenge it, he could do so in court. The casual arrogance of the words nearly unbalanced him, but he forced himself to remain steady, threatening to call the sheriff if they did not leave immediately. After several tense minutes, they gathered their equipment and retreated, but not before one of them muttered under his breath that fighting the board never ended well. Simon called the sheriff's department anyway, filing a report about unauthorized entry and vandalism of his property. The deputy who arrived was polite but non-committal, noting that disputes with HOAs were common and usually civil matters. He agreed to log the report but offered no assurances of follow-up. Watching the patrol car drive away, Simon realized that official channels would always move too slowly to deter the association's harassment. He was alone, and they knew it. That evening, as he sat beneath the oaks with his field recorder running, Simon made himself a promise. He would not allow attrition to wear him down. He would gather every shred of evidence, every map, every recording, and he would carry the fight beyond the narrow corridors of neighborhood meetings. The HOA had escalated by trespassing, vandalizing, and weaponizing bureaucracy. His escalation would be endurance, refusing to bend, refusing to be cornered into compliance, and refusing to let ancient trees be reduced to timber in the name of order. The second act of the battle was underway, and Simon knew there was no turning back. The morning of the hearing dawned with a brittle clarity that felt more like the moment before a storm than the calm after one. Simon had spent the night awake, sorting his folders, replaying the audio clip he had accidentally captured of the men discussing boundary adjustments, and reviewing every photograph and document he had archived over the long weeks of harassment. His house was littered with papers spread across tables and counters, the evidence of his resistance visible in stacks of printed maps, notarized copies, and carefully dated photographs of chalk markings, orange tags, and gouged bark. He had grown accustomed to the quiet isolation of the fight, but now, for the first time, he would have to present it in a room where every word would be scrutinized, every hesitation twisted against him. The county courthouse felt antiseptic, its beige walls and fluorescent lights designed to neutralize passion. Yet, when Simon entered the chamber and saw Linda Perlman seated with the HOA's attorney beside her, a polished man in a dark suit with a practiced expression of patient superiority, the weight of everything he had endured rose in his chest. They looked calm, as though the outcome were already decided, and Simon understood this was part of their performance, to project inevitability, to make him feel like a man standing against a tide. But when the judge entered and the proceedings began, Simon found his voice steadier than expected. He spoke slowly but with determination, laying out the sequence from the first letter to the trespasses and vandalism, producing the county registry that placed his oaks firmly within state-protected land, and finally submitting the recording of the voices discussing adjustments to the line. The HOA's attorney attempted to object, claiming the audio was inadmissible without verification of identity, but the judge allowed it provisionally, noting that the content suggested intent to manipulate boundaries. Simon saw Linda's expression flicker, a brief tightening around her mouth that betrayed the first crack in her composure. When the attorney countered by presenting the HOA's revised bylaws as proof of jurisdiction, Simon calmly pointed out that no local bylaw could override state ecological designation, and he emphasized that the state placard had been removed and replaced with a fraudulent HOA sign. The judge leaned forward at this, asking pointedly whether the association had authorized removal of state property. The attorney deflected, insisting no such action had been sanctioned, but Simon provided photographs with timestamps showing the change. What followed was less a debate than a slow unraveling of the association's narrative. Each time the attorney attempted to assert authority, Simon met it with a document, a photo, or a recorded note, until the accumulation of evidence weighed visibly on the room. The judge's questions turned sharper, and Linda's silence grew heavier. At last, after hours of testimony and counter-arguments, the judge ruled decisively that the oaks were located on land beyond HOA jurisdiction, that any attempt to cut or alter them had been unlawful, and that the association had overstepped its authority by issuing fines and work orders. Furthermore, the judge ordered an injunction prohibiting the HOA from any further interference with Simon's property and referred the matter of the removed state sign to the county prosecutor for investigation. As the gavel struck, Simon felt a rush of release so intense it left him momentarily lightheaded. He had expected relief, but not the fierce sense of vindication that surged through him. Linda gathered her papers with brittle motions, refusing to meet his eyes, while her attorney whispered urgently in her ear, Simon did not gloat, did not smile. He simply collected his folders and walked out of the chamber into the thin afternoon sunlight, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the corridor like the fading cadence of a battle won. Outside, standing on the courthouse steps, he let the weight of the weeks settle into his body. He thought of the oaks waiting on the ridge, scarred but still standing, and felt the first true breath of freedom since the conflict had begun. The HOA had thrown bureaucracy, intimidation, and manipulation at him, but in the end it was persistence, patience, and the unyielding presence of the truth that had carried the day. The climax of his struggle was not a dramatic confrontation with saws biting into wood, but the quiet force of evidence presented in a sterile room that nonetheless affirmed the right of old trees to remain where they belonged. In the weeks after the ruling, the neighborhood seemed to exhale, though not in relief for Simon's victory, but in the uneasy silence of people who preferred to forget the conflict ever happened. The HOA sent no more letters, no more contractors arrived at dawn, and the orange tags and chalk lines vanished as though they had never been placed. For Simon, the quiet felt different now. No longer the oppressive silence of intimidation, but the restorative stillness of space reclaimed. Each morning he walked the slope to check the oaks, running his hand along their scarred bark, acknowledging the wounds they bore as proof of endurance rather than fragility. Where once he had recorded their creaks only for work, he now found himself listening for them in the evenings as reminders of persistence that mirrored his own. The county soon replaced the missing state placard with a sturdier metal sign bolted deep into the ground, its lettering clear and undeniable. Protected, Ecological Corridor. Seeing it gleam in the sunlight gave Simon a satisfaction beyond personal vindication, because it meant the fight had left something tangible behind, a marker that could not be so easily removed again. When the prosecutor's inquiry into the missing sign was announced, whispers spread that Linda Perlman had stepped down from the HOA board citing personal reasons. Simon neither celebrated nor sought to humiliate her. He felt only a sober recognition that power built on manipulation eventually collapses under its own weight. Life did not return to what it had been before. Such battles leave their trace, but Simon discovered a steadier rhythm. He resumed his work in the studio, layering the sounds of the forest into new projects, yet each composition now carried an undertone of resolve that he could not ignore. Where once he had thought of the oaks as mere background for his recordings, they had become collaborators in his resilience, voices in a long conversation between nature and endurance. When neighbors eventually began nodding at him again, tentative acknowledgments of coexistence, Simon accepted them without resentment, knowing their silence during the struggle had been born of fear rather than malice. On a quiet evening near the end of summer, he found a small package left at the base of one of the trees. Inside was a sapling in a clay pot, its tag marked simply with the words, "For the next generation." He never discovered who left it, but he planted the sapling near the ridge, where its young leaves caught the wind alongside the older giants. As he stood back, the sun setting through the branches, Simon realized that the resolution of his battle was not merely the survival of the oaks, but the reminder that even when institutions fail, individuals can still choose to protect what endures.